The Life of David Livingston, Part 22. Meantime, other young men, having since distinguished, had been educating themselves as journalists, and like Bennett, through various fortune, among them was Horace Greeley, who established the first penny daily paper ever published in the world. But its foundation soon gave way. In 1841, the Tribune was established, and Mr. Bennett discovered in the great and varied abilities of Mr. Greeley and Henry J. Raymond, assistant editor, rivals whom no assaults could repress, and whose influence soon began to be felt and acknowledged throughout the country. The warfare long waged between these journalistic giants was always sharp, often fierce. The intense rivalry greatly augmented the enterprise of the printing press offices, which at length became vast establishments, employing thousands of men, from the greatest intellects of the age to the ragged urchins of the street, and receiving and dispersing vast sums of money. The invention of the telegraph added immensely to the scope and power of the daily press. Greatly increasing its expenditures, it also greatly augmented its circulation and profits. Its demand for brain labor became perfectly prodigious, and it almost monopolized the genius of the land. In the city of New York, there were established within the very few years after Morse's invention had begun regularly to click the news of the day no less than 4 morning journals of acknowledged reputation throughout the world, and which, upon certain memorable occasions of certain intelligence, have contained in their combined columns nearly as great an amount of reading as matter as of the whole of Bancroft's History of the United States. The average quantity of these journals reading matter of interest to the general public is equivalent every day to from 3 to 5 volumes of Bancroft's distinguished work. Other cities of the Republic have been little, if any, behind the commercial and financial metropolis, excepting only the city of Washington, whose most successful journalism of old school has given way, at least till quite recently, to a series of wretched failures. Editorials of a journal published in the largest city of our lake country, which was a straggling hamlet when Dr. Livingston first went to Africa, have been known to make the proudest speculations of Wall Street tremble, and powerful corporations to abandon long conceived schemes of injustice. In an exhaustive article on the United States Census of 1860, the New York Tribune said of the public press, "The very great increase in the circulation of newspapers and periodicals during the last 10 years is an evidence at once of a high degree of popular intelligence and of high standard of journalistic ability. There is no doubt that this country has the best and the best sustained public press in the world. The best, we mean, for the people and not merely the learned few. Newspapers penetrate to every part of the country, reach even the most obscure hamlet, and find their way to almost every household. Printing offices go with the vanguard of civilization toward the west, and in the new country are about as numerous as the mills. The dailies of the great cities cannot be carried by the government mails. They have created, during the decade, an entirely new line of business, supporting thousands of families on issues fairly joined. They have defeated many of the most maturely considered measures of congressional committees. Having given the statistics in regard to the number of and circulation of the periodicals and papers of the country at the time under examination, the article goes on to say, the total number of daily papers thrown from the press during the year is about half that of all the other papers and periodicals combined. Supposing each one to weigh an ounce, the weight of the whole number of daily papers printed in the United States during the year of the census was done was 28,644,000 pounds of avoridoripolis, enough to load 14,300 wagons with a ton each, and to make a train of them 70 miles in length. Were all these papers and periodicals printed in 1860 placed in such a train, it would reach from New York to Richmond. Should they be pasted into one vast sheet, they would make a covering for the continent and leave a remnant large enough to shut out the sun from the British Isles. But large enough to shut no they would make a covering for the continent. I doubt that. But not to dwell upon the mere material aspect of the public press of America, it will suffice to say that if its records shall be preserved, the historian of 2,000 years hence, who shall narrate the events which are now taking place, will find upon their dingy pages his best authorities and his most trustworthy sources of philosophical generalization. Not all that is left of Grecian literature, not all the grand works of the fine old Romans, give so correct a picture of the great peoples of antiquity as the daily papers of America are now taking of a people far greater than those whose phalanges swept down the barbarians from the Hellespont to the Indus, or than that the tramp of whose legions echoed round the world. To such magnificent proportions and such stupendous influence had the American press grown during Livingston's first sojourn in Africa. When he left England, its chief business was to chronicle some beer. When he returned, its power was more than imperial, and all exercised through persuasion. As it had grown in America, so it had been immensely developed in other lands. But in respect of the publication of current intelligence at the time of the happening of events, the American press is not approached by that of any other country. There is more telegraphic news in almost any number of any Chicago daily, for example, than the average quantity of such intelligence in the London Times. In addition, an additional impetus to the enterprise of journalism was given by the success of the Atlantic cable during Livingston's second great expedition to Africa. It's difficult to believe these great facts, though they have occurred before our very eyes. This wonderful achievement of science, aided by the no less wonderful enterprise of the daily press of the United States, made the inhabitants of Christendom like next-door neighbors. A dispatch from Athens in Greece was once published by all the evening daily journals of the United States at an earlier hour than its date. The difference of time and the girdle round about the earth put the inhabitants of the Mississippi Valley, as they took their suppers, in a situation in which they might have criticized an oration by Demosthenes before he had gone to bed, had Demosthenes belonged to this day and generation. Thus had the press become the great means of the dissemination of knowledge, and by reason of the wonderful enterprise of its most distinguished representatives, men far more potential in the affairs of the world than any potentate or any government. It had come to be acknowledged as of the greatest consequence in the dissemination of science, in popularizing literature, in aiding moral, social, and political reform, but the responsibility of its enterprising spirit, its superiority even to the most powerful government in respect to obtaining intelligence, remained to be conclusively shown. and even this was done by the expedition of Mr. Henry M. Stanley in the employ of the New York Herald in search of Dr. Livingston, long lost from Christendom in the wilds of Central Africa. So deep an interest did the government of Great Britain take in discovering the truth of the reports of the explorer's death, first given to the world through the story of Ali Musa and condensed by Dr. Seward, English resident agent at Zanzibar, the substance of which appears in the preceding chapter, and an expedition in that behalf was organized, and after many hundred miles of journeying by river and land found unmistakable evidence that Musa's story was a cruel fabrication. So, too, when years had elapsed without definite information from Dr. Livingston, and there arose a world of wild conjecture as to his fate, the British government again organized an expedition of search which, as we have seen, was at last accounts from it at Zanzibar, well prepared for an expedition inland, but waiting for a proper season at which to begin the journey. Meantime, the great discoverer is discovered in the heart of equatorial Africa by Mr. Henry Stanley, in command of the expedition in search, sent out under the auspices of an American newspaper, the New York Herald. Thus did newspaper enterprise accomplish that in which the combined efforts of wealthy religious societies, learned corporate bodies, and one of the most powerful governments on earth had failed. A brief account of this unique expedition will be of interest. During the Civil War of the United States, 1861 to 65, among the many war correspondents of the Herald was Mr. Stanley, just mentioned. He was not so much distinguished as a writer as he was valuable as to the journal on account of his fearless nature and his restless activity. In imitation of Tennyson's charge of the Light Brigade, he would pursue an item in the search, if the search should carry him into the jaws of hell. Restrained by no danger, almost insensible to fatigue, he could ride all day and write all night, almost, and keep up his hard work for an indefinite period. After the war, he went abroad and from various countries, generally out of the way of ordinary lines of travel, corresponded with the Herald, when the proprietors of the journal, the elder Mr. Bennett, was then living, determined to organize a Herald special search expedition. They naturally elected Mr. Stanley as its commander. This was in 1868. Mr. Stanley at once accepted the challenge, and after some hesitation was to whether he should proceed through Egypt up the Nile, or by way of Zanzibar, and then westward overland and by line of the river Rovuma. The route taken by Livingston, he at length resolved to go by the way of the Zanzibar. This is an island and town, also the same name, off the coast of Zanzibar, and is toward the southern limit of Mohammedan rule in Africa. Here Mr. Stanley arrived in due season, and hence wrote his first letter in his special service under date of February 9, 1869. It chiefly had reference to Livingston's previous explorations, the story of his death and its refutation, but the report that he was only about a week's march inland from Zanzibar also received a quietus, and Mr. Stanley, as well as Nye, pursued to retrace his steps to Egypt and proceed by way of the Nile in consequence of the following note from the United States Vice Consul. Quote, "The island of Zanzibar, December 26, 1868. Dear Sir, I should be most happy to assist you in any way whatever But in reply to your note, I beg to assure you of my candid belief of his non-appearance. There is not the slightest probability of his ever coming again to this island. Dr. Kirk, the British vice consul here, and who was with Dr. Livingston for some years during his travels in Africa, thinks it more than probable that he will come out at the Nile, and has not the least expectation of having the pleasure of seeing him here. In September 1868, Her Majesty's ship Octavia, Sir Leopold's health, CB, left here, and as I see by the Bombay papers, on her arrival at Trincomalee, which is in Ceylon, reported that when she left Zanzibar, Dr. Livingston was reported within a week's march of the coast. This, if you saw it, probably misled you to believe he would come here, but it is hardly necessary to say that the statement was without the slightest foundation of truth, and was probably written from some entire misconception by the writer of some conversation which took place between him and Dr. Kirk. Trusting, however, you will succeed. On the other side, I am, dear sir, very respectfully, Francis R. Webb, United States Vice Consul. End quote. Nevertheless, Mr. Stanley determined to go on and telegraphing to an acquaintance residing at Khartoum, Upper Nubia, to send him word if anything should be heard from Livingston, went forward with the preparations for his journey. He was doubtless cognizant of the fact also that the Herald had also another search expedition on foot, to which the Khedive of Egypt was rendering generous encouragement and assistance. It may well be imagined that the drafts upon the Herald at the time for necessary outlays in the purchase of horses, asses, and supplies, and the employment of a sufficient escort, mainly consisting of a number of Arabs, were not light. The preparations, after months' delay caused by war in the interior, were at length made, and the expedition left Zanzibar on the long-ago trail of the great explorer. And here it'll be proper, while we are awaiting intelligence of its difficulties and final great success, to speak of the previous life of him who was to make so many hearts glad by tidings of the safety of the most distinguished explorer of our times.